Most of us hold strict personal standards against cruelty. We consider ourselves compassionate. Yet, human history is heavily populated by periods where ordinary, considerate people actively participate in, or quietly tolerate, mass violence and systemic harm. The question is how these two realities coexist in the same mind. Traditional psychology often assumes that if you know right from wrong, you will act accordingly. But moral reasoning alone does not prevent harm. People suffer from wrongs done to them regardless of how well the perpetrator can justify it internally. To understand actual behavior, we have to look at the agentic theory of morality. In this framework, moral reasoning only translates into action through an internal self-regulatory system. This system operates on self-sanctions. We monitor our own conduct, judge it against our personal standards, and regulate our actions to avoid self-condemnation and maintain a sense of self-worth. This creates two forms of moral agency. The inhibitive form is the power to simply refrain from behaving inhumanely. The proactive form is the power to behave humanely, sometimes at heavy personal cost, because failing to do so would trigger intense self-devaluation. But these self-regulatory mechanisms do not operate automatically. They have to be actively engaged. And because they require activation, they represent a critical vulnerability. They can be selectively deactivated. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent decades researching exactly how this deactivation occurs. He identified a process called moral disengagement. These are specific psychosocial maneuvers that allow individuals to bypass their own moral self-sanctions, permitting them to carry out inhumane conduct free from the restraint of self-censure. Bandura mapped these maneuvers to 4 distinct points of failure in the self-regulatory process: the behavior itself, the agency of the perpetrator, the consequences of the action, and the victim. This chart maps the cognitive architecture of atrocity. It isolates the exact points where internal control is bypassed, tracing the path from the initial reprehensible conduct down to the victim. By examining each locus on this map, we can trace the precise psychological steps that turn decent people into willing executioners. The first set of disengagement practices operates directly on the cognitive reconstruction of the harmful behavior itself. People rarely engage in harmful conduct until they have justified the morality of their actions. Through moral justification, detrimental conduct is reconstructed to appear socially worthy. This cognitive restructuring relies heavily on language. Euphemistic labeling camouflages pernicious activities in innocent parlance, which sharply reduces the perpetrator's sense of personal responsibility. As Bandura documents, military bombing missions become servicing the target, and civilians killed in the strikes are linguistically converted to collateral damage. The tobacco and nuclear industries employ similar specialized jargon to sanitize the lethal effects of their operations. Another tactic is advantageous comparison. By exploiting the contrast principle, a harmful act is made to look benevolent by comparing it to the more flagrant cruelties of an adversary. Taken together, these cognitive restructurings are highly effective. Once destructive conduct is clothed in moral wrappings, the perpetrator is no longer acting on an urge to do harm. They are acting on a moral imperative. The next 2 sets of practices bypass self-censure by obscuring the individual's role in the harm and by disregarding the outcomes of their actions. Under displacement of responsibility, people view their actions as stemming from the dictates of authorities. Because they are not the actual agent of their actions, they are spared self-condemning reactions. This chart from Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments shows the percentage of people fully obedient to injurious commands. The rate of obedient aggression drops significantly as the physical closeness and legitimization of the authority figure decreases. When direct authority isn't present, a sense of personal agency can be obscured by diffusing responsibility. This is typically achieved through a division of labor, where a task is fractured into subfunctions that seem harmless in isolation. This chart measures the level of punitiveness individuals are willing to inflict on others. The data separates into 2 tracks. People act significantly more cruelly when the severity of their actions is determined jointly by a group, rather than when held personally accountable. Moral control is further weakened when the harmful effects of one's actions are ignored or distorted. It is simply easier to harm others when their suffering is not visible, a dynamic amplified by modern remote technologies. Looking at data plotting obedience against the victim's proximity, we see a steep, linear drop in compliance. The moment the victim's pain becomes visible and audible, vicariously aroused distress activates self-restraining sanctions. When you combine these mechanisms, fragmenting the task, shifting the blame to authorities, distancing the actor from the outcome, social systems can smoothly induce decent people to perform extraordinarily cruel things. The final locus of disengagement operates directly on the targets of the detrimental acts. Perceiving another person in terms of common humanity activates empathetic emotional reactions. To mistreat someone without suffering personal distress, the perpetrator must strip the target of their human qualities, portraying them as subhuman objects or bestial creatures. Figure 5 shows humanized subjects receiving stable shocks, while punitive toward dehumanized recipients steadily escalates. The danger compounds when mechanisms overlap. Figure 6 reveals that combining diffused group responsibility with dehumanization results in an exponential spike in cruelty. This devaluation is reinforced through the attribution of blame. Perpetrators select a defensive act by the adversary from a complex chain of events, portray it as an unprovoked attack, and convince themselves they are faultless victims forced into a defensive reaction. Dehumanization acts as an essential ingredient in the perpetration of inhumanities. By eliminating the empathic response, it removes the final psychological barrier to violence. These individual cognitive mechanisms do not operate in a vacuum. They coalesce into supportive networks of legitimate enterprises, often run by otherwise considerate people. The transformation into a willing participant in harm is rarely immediate. It relies on gradualistic moral disengagement. Individuals initially perform minor aggressive acts they can tolerate. As their self-reproof diminishes through repeated enactments, the level of ruthlessness increases until abhorrent practices become thoughtlessly routinized. Bandura highlights the case at a prominent American weapons merchant who supplied despots and terrorists. To avoid self-censure, he masked his operations as a legitimate business fulfilling consumer needs, actively avoided knowledge of how his weapons were used, and compared his trade favorably to companies manufacturing napalm. Similarly, the tobacco industry spent years disregarding evidence of its harmful consequences. Maintaining that operation required a vast supporting cast: chemists engineering higher nicotine absorption rates, creative advertisers targeting youth, and legislators blocking regulation. The cognitive architecture required to merchandise deathly wares is identical to the architecture required for state-level atrocities. Both rely on fractionating operations and displacing responsibility across a network of respectable agents. These mechanisms scale all the way down to everyday interactions, including peer victimization in middle schools. A 2024 longitudinal study analyzed the bystander behaviors of over 1,300 adolescents. Researchers mapped Bandura's framework onto schoolyard bullying, tracking what leads students to actively support aggressive behavior. The data revealed a clear predictive pathway. High levels of moral disengagement in the 7th grade strongly predicted an increase in pro-aggressive bystanding by the 8th grade. However, the study also identified a proactive countermeasure: defender self-efficacy. This is a student's ingrained belief in their own capability to successfully intervene and protect a victim. High defender self-efficacy is mathematically associated with more active defending and less passive bystanding. It acts as the cognitive engine required to override moral disengagement and activate proactive moral agency. Effective preventative interventions cannot solely focus on punishing bad behavior. They must simultaneously dismantle the specific justifications for disengagement while aggressively building the individual's self-efficacy. Human conduct is not fixed by moral reasoning. Knowing right from wrong is merely a prerequisite. True moral agency is the ongoing exercise of self-influence, a cognitive regulatory system that requires constant, vigilant activation to maintain our humanity.